Hi everyone, and welcome back to class. In today's video, we're going to introduce the idea of philosophical nihilism. And this idea of nihilism is actually something that many of you are probably already familiar with, but it's something that I need to make sure that we go over so you can understand its roots, its origins, just where it comes from. Because you might understand nihilism because, well, it's a very popular idea here in the 21st century. It's very popular amongst millennials and Gen Z. Both generations have a very nihilistic outlook. And Gen Z is actually taking nihilism and embracing it even more so than millennials have. But nihilism is one of those things that we all just kind of know what it is, because it is such a modern philosophy. In fact, philosophical nihilism was really only beginning to be discussed and talked about in the 19th century. So it is a much newer idea than, say, some of the other things that we have covered. Now, in discussing nihilism, one of the key places to start is with individuals like Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche. So we're going to actually start with Friedrich Nietzsche, and in this lecture, talking about his writing known as The Parable of the Madman. Now, Nietzsche is an individual who many of you are probably familiar with. You've probably heard of him before. The reason for this is he's very popular. He writes in a very poetic, flowery type of prose when it comes to his philosophy, and as you should know at this point, philosophy isn't written like that. Philosophy is written very much in an argumentative, persuasive essay format where we use rhetorical questions and jargon to bring about creative ideas and creative thinking. It's not written in a prose. It's not written like a short story, and because of that, it does turn off quite a bit of people. But due to this, that's what brought a lot of people over to Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche's writing, being in prose, being in a more poetic, flowery language, actually helped him to reach a more general population, the more general masses when it came to spreading out his philosophy. Many of you are probably already familiar with a few of his key ideas, even though they are often misquoted. For example, the one that we're going to talk about today, many of you have probably heard of the idea, God is dead and we have killed him. You've probably heard that before, and if you have, that's Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, most of the time when somebody says God is dead and we have killed him, they are misquoting Nietzsche. They're often using this in a religious argument or a religious debate. And while Friedrich Nietzsche was unapologetically an atheist, the phrase God is dead isn't attributed to his arguments to disprove God's existence or anything like that. It's not connected to his atheistic arguments really at all when you look at it. In fact, they're more connected to his nihilistic argument, which some people might go, well, his nihilistic argument is in connection to his atheistic argument because nihilism has a touch of atheism in connection to it. And while in essence this is true, I don't want us to be stuck on the argument of religion when looking at nihilism or Friedrich Nietzsche's Parable of the Madman, because that's not really the purpose or the point of it. So many people do often misquote him here. They do misuse his quote of God is dead and we have killed him. So we're going to look at that and explain what it is and how that introduces us to the idea of nihilism, which leads us to what is known as existentialism. So in this video, we're going to go over, as you probably guessed, the Parable of the Madman, as I've stated multiple times, which is why you didn't even really have to guess. And we're going to explain how that actually works and really just what it means. Okay, so to start our discussion on the Parable of the Madman, the first thing that you really need to do is to read the Parable of the Madman. Now, again, you may recognize some of those quotes, specifically, God is dead and we have killed him. Now, I want you to take note that the full quote is actually God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. So what does this mean? What in the hell does this entire parable mean from Nietzsche? Well, Nietzsche's Parable of the Madman, again, it's not a religious statement. It's not a statement claiming to prove or disprove the existence of God. It's not Nietzsche making an atheistic claim that God doesn't exist. Instead, it's Nietzsche making a cultural claim, a social claim, that we as a community, we as a society, have killed God. But what does that mean? What does it mean to have killed God? Well, what it means is that we have removed God from a place of importance. We've removed God from a central place of prominence in the Western community. And we have replaced God with science. Nihilism is the belief that there is no purpose to our lives. There is no greater purpose to the universe, cosmologically speaking. There is no metaphysical, cosmological, God-given purpose to our existence under the idea of nihilism. Nihilism instead would suggest that we are met with a cold scientific universe as opposed to a religious one. Instead of a one that has cosmological meaning or metaphysical purpose, we are instead met with a scientific universe. So how did nihilism come about? Well, after the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, God's place in the Western world was pushed back because science began answering all of the questions that we used to attribute to God. You know, us as a human society, whenever we didn't understand something before the scientific revolution or the Enlightenment, we would say, well, I don't know why it rains, it must be God. Or I don't know why this happens, it must be God. I don't understand this, it must be God. But as science began to answer more and more questions, we began to take away, well, it wasn't God, it was high pressure and low pressure. It was condensation building up in the clouds. It's the shifting of tectonic plates. It's the movement of atoms. It's the conservation of energy. It's gravity. We began to answer it with all of these scientific physical laws and explanations. So God's importance in society began to go back and back and back. It began to go away. And God was moved from the central place in society to the side. God was placed from the front burner to the back burner of Western culture. And in his place, science was put on the front burner. Science is now the first thing that we consult when it comes to answering questions about human existence and life. We don't look to God anymore. We look to science. And so when we do this, when we remove God from a place of central importance and put the emphasis on science, what we get is nihilism. Think of one of the most prominent popular human questions around. Why do I exist? Why am I here? If God is not a premise in that, if God is not the answer, why are you here? In a cold, calculating, scientific universe, the answer to why you're here is nothing more than mere chance. There is no greater meaning assigned to your life or to your purpose. So the parable of the madman isn't meant to point out that God does or does not exist. Again, Nietzsche is an unapologetic atheist. Like, he is an atheist, and he is not sorry about that in one bit, and it makes up a very big part of his philosophy. But in the parable of the madman, he is not making an atheistic claim. He's making a cultural one. He's claiming, hey, our society has moved away from religion. Our society has moved away from God, and we're kind of just going through the motions of it. We don't realize it yet. I mean, think about it. The madman jumps into the crowd of society and he says, how shall we comfort the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off of us? We have killed God. There has never been a greater deed, and whoever is born after us, for the sake of this deed, he will belong to a higher history hitherto. Our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren will experience a different culture, a different human experience than the ones we experienced 200, 300, 500 years ago, because science has taken the prominent place in society. Nietzsche goes on to say that the madman fell silent and looked again at his listeners, and they too were silent and stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern on the ground, and it broke into pieces and went out. I have come too early, he said then. It is not, my time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars requires time. Deeds, though done, still require time to be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than most distant stars, and yet they have done it to themselves. We as a community have shifted into a more scientific one. We have taken God and put God on the back burner, put God over onto the side, in the corner, however you want to phrase it. We have put God over somewhere else. God is not the prominent figure in Western society anymore. And so in doing so, this is what Nietzsche means by the death of God. God's death is not a literal death. God is not literally dead whether God does or does not exist. God is not, that's not the question. To say God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him, is to say that we have killed God's importance in community. We have killed God's importance in the Western world, and we've replaced him with science. Science has replaced God's position. So now when we look at ourselves and we ask, why am I here? What's the point of my existence? There is no answer. There is nothing in a cold, calculated scientific universe. That's nihilism, and that's the parable of the madman. And if you think about it, Nietzsche wasn't very far off. He argued that we did this to ourselves and that we don't realize it yet, but we would in the future. Nietzsche wrote this in 1882. That's 140 years ago. Think about how much more secular the Western world has become in 140 years. Think about how much more scientific we have become. Nihilism, as I said, is very popular amongst millennials and Gen Z. This is a very real philosophy, one that is taking root. Now, the interesting thing is that you can believe in nihilism and still be a religious person. You can believe, of course, that we can examine what it is to be nihilistic, even if you have religious beliefs, because nihilism, again, is to examine and understand the human condition. Oh, God bless you. Hello, good sir. Nihilism is to examine and understand the human condition in the removal of God. So you can be an individual who is agnostic or who is atheist and fully latch on to nihilism as a personal philosophy. You can also be a religious, theistic individual and ask this question and examine that question and learn things about yourself. You don't have to accept that God isn't real to accept nihilism, to accept this idea that we have created a society where God is no longer the central figure, or that to examine the human condition under these types of premises. Because in doing this, what we have done... Oh, hold on. In doing this, what we have done is we have actually created the knee-jerk reaction to nihilism known as existentialism. So we're not going to talk about existentialism too much in this video, just this little quick closing bit, but there will be more about it later on. Existentialism is essentially the knee-jerk reaction to nihilism. You can't really have one without the other. Because as human beings, we are essentially cursed in believing that we should be able to find purpose or meaning to our existence. We should be able to find some type of cosmological meaning to why am I here? Why do I belong? Why do I exist? And in removing God as the answer to that, we now have to find a personal reason for that existence. And that's what existentialism is. Existentialism is the meaning that we find for our own existence, the personal answer, the personal meaning that we find for our own existence. And that can be existentialism, the meaning you find for your existence can be money, can be a job, can be art or creating or craft, can be family, can be friends, can be travel, or it can be religion. If you have faith, if you want to be religious, that can be the existential meaning that you find for yourself. Because again, nihilism doesn't have to exist only in the atheistic world. You, as a religious individual, can examine nihilism as a religious individual and accept this idea that we have potentially no meaning to our existence. Maybe God exists, and maybe when God created you, God didn't give you a purpose. God didn't create you with a reason. Because we like to tell ourselves that if we're religious. We like to say, well, my God created me for a reason, for a purpose. But why? Why did your God create you? Did they create you with a meaning? Did they actually create you with a purpose? Maybe God just, bam, created the universe and left it at that, and you did come about through random happenstance, as nihilism suggests. Maybe when God created you and went, bam, haha, Susie exists, that was the end of it. God created Susie, but with no real purpose or meaning in mind. Or maybe God created you with the hope of a purpose, but you still have to find that purpose or meaning for yourself. That's where existentialism comes in. And so there are both theistic existentialists and atheistic existentialists, and existentialism is a very popular form of philosophy here in the 20th and 21st centuries. So I do highly suggest, hello, good sir, again, I do suggest that you look into it in your own free time, because a lot of those questions, why am I here, why do I exist, those are existentialist questions. And even if you are or are not a person of faith, these are questions that are important for us to answer to define ourselves in the human experience. Because again, existentialism does not exist purely in an atheistic vacuum. Even if some people want to try to tell you it does, that's not the point. And in fact, in the next video, when we look at Jean-Paul Sartre, I will point out a very important quote that proves existentialism is a practice of human experience, not one of atheistic or theistic existentialist experience alone. It's human regardless of your spiritual beliefs. Well, thank you all so much for coming into this video. I hope you've enjoyed learning about the parable of the madman, the parable of the madman, and kind of the what I look at as some of the most important foundations and roots of nihilism. There are many more that we can explore. Again, I already mentioned Arthur Schopenhauer, but I look at Nietzsche's Parable of the Madman as being one of the most important pieces of nihilistic literature to examine when beginning the study of nihilism. But thank you all for coming. Oliver says goodbye. I say goodbye. Thank you for joining us for this lesson, and we'll see you next time. Bye. Sir. Yes, hi. Aww.